I'd mentioned a little earlier about like the forecast and the humerus bone and certain factors that seem to be, the thing about orthopedic surgery involving a forecast, or even, it's almost kind of like even like Vic's formula 44, or the pi r squared of 4 being 44. Vic's being, the thing about vice. Kind of like, here lately I've been thinking about, is it really an issue of celebrating Juneteenth as, COVID-19 as like an issue of like, Zion National Park and Grover, Cleveland as a U.S. $1,000 bill, as a summit meeting, or, Camp David in Pearland, Texas. Or is it really the idea, of, Bureau of Vital Statistics and, the carbon footprint of a birth certificate, or preliminary prejudice or product registration of a birth certificate, or the thought of an idea of Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shuttle government Stargate program as some idea of like a Juneteenth as a celebration of like COVID-19, or the idea, of, Camp David, suggesting some idea that Pearland, Texas is some, issue involving, Vice President Networks as Zion National Park presenting, the American thing about the Mormon Church, as well as Zion being 1,000 years of peace, and, Grover, Cleveland on a U.S. $1,000 bill. And the thing of it is that it seems to be presenting, whether or not, of, Israel presenting some idea that would be normally the difference between the African-Americans of 64 and like an American, as compared to Israeli, with Israel and the I, in African-Americans of 73, of like Harris, Egypt, and Israel, and Israeli itself as some idea of like a Harris, Egypt, and the unionized thing about the Houston, Texas area of Electronic Power Wing International and Selective Service and other factors that seem to be, so parallel in Texas in a way, with just the African-Americans of 41 being like USA, or the EPA being some idea of like the electronic power of America as compared to USA and African-Americans of 41 that way. Applied to like African-Americans being African-Americans of like itself as 140 parallel in Texas, or FBI psychology minus, the 22 thing of the FDIC or RCA. It's even gotten to the thing about, Con Air and like Nicolas Cage in that movie Con Air, and like that plane knocking the arm off of like at the Hard Rock Cafe, if it's really the issue of a 22 fret and 24 fret, guitar with the arm, and the African-Americans of like 22 frets being what is that, the 22 and 28, 46, 66, and 71. And the S being the African-Americans of like 90 in Brazoria, 22 frets being like African-Americans of 90 like Brazoria. This right here, parallel in Texas, or the thought of like Washington D.C. presenting the idea of District of Columbia as a method banking as Colombian. I am not Colombian, and not necessarily the issue, but similarly, if it's ultimately getting to a carbon footprint, and absentee voting as some idea of like a celebration, or some idea of like some highlighting issue like Juneteenth, and some idea of like COVID-19 and Juneteenth, highlighting some issues that seem to be in my mind involving like Zion National Park in Utah being African-Americans of 50, and even the thought of like Ulysses S. Grant combined like a sit alone with a Pell Grant, or some method of like monopolizing capitalization using the international law of like intellectual property as having fair use of family law, having the word as compared to like legal terminology. Normally I don't like using the word research. It seems to be so like not a direct involvement with like international law, that doesn't seem involving situational and a bunch of cross-referencing or overall opinionated decision as case precedents. But the thing about family law, as like foster granting and the presence as like the whole issue in family law, and yet a telepathic symbol, like a telepathic mediation in the sky on the backside of the US $1 representative in between the C and the PTIS, like the spirit of adoption, or Brazoria Country, the African Americans 206, as compared to like Galveston County or like the area code of Los Angeles being 213 and telepathic brainwaves. The automatic, Chevrolet Silverado Z71 thing in Pearland, or the Chevrolet IROC Z28, and the thing about 28 being like the bank of the air, as compared to live on air, being Alphamarks 105, or the savior thing about the SAVIOUR and the Alphamarks 105 live on air that way. It's like, it seemed to be like all that information, and if it's really ultimately getting to the thought of a preliminary prejudice product registration of the birth certificate, or the idea of Alphamarks 71 or Babylon or Pearland, or what the real deal is with the FDIC claim, as some thought of like the whole idea of like information being made available as like economics seems to be the whole entire issue involving importing and exporting, of how economics only seems to be the ones who actually provide the availability of what it means to be in the geographical area based upon importing and exporting involving economics. It seems to be identified more so involving plain horizons, more so at that level of like corporate law as compared to like business law, more so like on a local level of like a pie chart. Yet it presents that pie chart like a circle with a dot in it, like the whole issue about it in my mind is ultimately the one cycle of frequency being measured in oscillation with the center line of oscillation at a 90 degree being like a circle with a dot, and it seemed to be like even the O and the year O, thank heaven for 7-Eleven, and the thing about 790 degrees of the 7-point crown of the Statue of Liberty, and it seemed to be like the thank heaven for 7-Eleven, the year O thing about center point energy and energy traded in the North American Free Trade Act involving monetary and domestic, or some idea of transition based upon McDonald's golden arches if both have cycles above center line of oscillation or the equator. And it seemed to be like even center point energy using the smart meter as a transponder as like a latitude, and all these things could be. I'm in a tent in my own home and I'm on supplemental security income, okay, and like I really get into like studying linguistic alphanumerics, and really think about it, like all the time. It's unreal, almost not cool how much I think about it. It's just like seriously, like beyond like sometimes like you gotta be kidding me. But in any case, so like it seemed to be that the monetary and domestic aggregates is identifying a factor, even the relation between what has been identified as what seemed to be the acronym of OSHA, Occupational Safety Health Administration, in pronunciation, and that one cycle, a second above the letter N as Latin terminology, and that pronunciation of nya, the NYA pronunciation, and that what would look like one cycle of frequency above the letter N in Latin terminology and pronunciation. Yet it seemed to be the thing where it's really at with the acronym OSHA, the misappropriation of allocation, even the thing about the U.S. $1 defined and described in the 6th how the Federal Reserve runs the country below the equator, and the similarities of the same practical application that Obama is referring to involving the Al-Qaeda thing. But it seemed to be the thing about linguistic alphanumerics and practical application like a transition as an academic thing, as legal terminology, involving like the Persian Gulf and the Nile and Euphrates, the similarities of like Amazon and Amazon.com, and the 90 degree of the one and only latitude, normally identified that would ought to be the one and only thought of the equator, at 0 degrees being one and only, at 90 would equate to like the longitude, as compared to the equator being a latitude. Yeah, it seemed to be that center point energy presenting that frequency at a 90 degree, the center point being like a circle with a dot in it, or even Diners Club at a 90 degree, or the field scope and range, and the accuracy of like affirmative action, and some telepathic mediation in the sky that way of the symbolic representation between the C and the PTIS on the backside of the U.S. $1 bill. But Obama had referred to Al-Qaeda in a way that's like really not cool. But it seemed to be, the secrets of the temple, how the Federal Reserve runs the country, and how it's described in the book as below the equator. And there's a movie, Dead Below Zero, and there's one commercial, okay, and the content, and the guy, once again, it's ultimately like a 12-step program of like, a controlled issue that normally is like some idea of availability that's normally like some idea of recreational use, ultimately, that's been led to believe based upon, television programming that a nightclub would, normally originate as some thought of like where that actually happens. But anyway, there's that one movie, Dead Below Zero, and it seemed to be like the commercial at the same time, and ultimately the song seemed to have this significance. I've always been chasing rainbows, waiting for little bluebirds. And I have to think about the last several words, but it seemed to be like even, the thing about Judy Garland and, the Wizard of Oz and like, Toto and all the information, as somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. And it seemed to be the thing about, the Bluebird bus and American Express and the Bluebird card and ultimately going to the circuit and, even the Israeli bird, the whoop on the blue and purple bird. But, the Airbus, beyond, the Bluebird bus and the Airbus, the helicopter that's actually used as private, presidential, and like military, like the H-160, something, that was like going on, while I was going through it, and like the issue was remembering everything because of air raids, going through certain, and air raids like while I was asleep, it became like a seriously, thing about, during like 1994, 95, and 96 predominantly, of the World Trade Center, as compared to the difference of Six Flags, and Six Flags, for real, like Southwestern Bell reach out and touch someone, like a Flag Day in like June 14th, 1992, the baptism for real, and even the book cover like Psychic War, America's Foremost Psychic Spy, and the cover up of the CIA's top secret Stargate program. You look at the book cover and ultimately, it seemed to be like, ultimately it's really, about a baptism, not limited to, but for real, about the guy underwater. But anyway, yeah, so like, there seemed to be the thing about, ultimately leading to some idea of like whether or not if Juneteenth is using COVID-19 as some idea of celebration of a political science celebration of like, graffiti and confetti as like birth certificates, or some like carbon footprint being led, beyond biometrics of like LightScribe. The thing about, LightScribe ultimately, beyond biometrics that would present, invisible programming of a whole bunch of white stuff. Ultimately, in my mind, even the information of the secrets of the temple and during the Ronald Reagan administration, and Ronald Reagan calling like Paul Volcker the name in the book, as the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and I think he actually was placed in two positions by Ronald Reagan as an economic advisor and Secretary of Treasury, and he was called from like the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the president Paul Volcker, to get the economic situation back in line, in perspective, and that's what Ronald Reagan did, was actually chose him to do that. But likewise, all that information, also it presents the U.S. dollar, in a way as compared to, a daily standard transaction at a bank that would represent more so the signature and endorsement, like Robert E. Rubin as the Secretary of Treasury seemed to be, like the one, involving more so the name of a current affair of an endorsement, not necessarily a separation between church and state, or neglect based on lack of experience, or, the thought of the real issue of like a current event, a current affair, as compared to, the idea of like neglect based on lack of experience of, some idea of like a SAN software presenting an issue between storage area network as compared to, securities and annuities of international financial management. Normally, in any case, so like the, Secretary of Treasury Robert E. Rubin and his involvement with like Citigroup in Detroit, and the thing about General Motors predominantly seemed to be like the deal about de facto. Like I say, I've read so many cases of the United States Supreme Court Southwest Court Reporter, predominantly of the Houston area being like the Southwestern Bell thing in Code Blue, and the Southwest Freeway, ultimately Highway 59, at an 8 o'clock position, and ultimately whether AM or PM at 8 o'clock is predominantly, like right at 247 degrees, And it gets to like, all the African American linguistics of like Los Angeles, or like governor as president, 109 is 110, or Los Angeles being like YouTube, African American's 109 or governor or written, the Ford is written thing, and a whole bunch of information, even area code 213, but it seemed to be the thing about, the African Americans 247, even Secretary of Treasury Robert E. Rubin, and a bicentennial quarter, and 200-year celebration of America. Robert E. Rubin, it seemed to be his name with E. Rubin, the way it's spelled in the King James Version Bible, as one of the tribes of Israel, being the tribe of scribes, presents all that stuff about isometrics by even, the thought of like using the stars for navigation, some idea of like a perfect 10-10 vision in the planetarium, or infinity on a zoom lens, is ultimately what it seemed to, really get to, and the figure 8, and, even ice skating, what the arctic circle is, and thing about pi r squared being the two zeros, or using radius by degree definition of its intended use as compared to pronunciation itself as an analytical and symbolic will arrive in as based upon pronunciation itself of the second circle, the second zero, the second O, and have an analytical and symbolic grade of linguistic alphanumerics as compared to, the automatic perception of, Agent 007, or, the idea of like 00 being, the figure 8, and infinity on the zoom lens, and international financial management as like, Lincoln Continental Hood Ornament and 90 degree, ultimately Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program, and how the kernel and television programming seem to be the thing about, how even Dr. Pepper or deed restrictions, a medical power of attorney using like a fiction real estate for deed restrictions, or the idea of mechanics lien, or what television programming would only present as compared to a commercial venue of living quarters. And that seems to be like where I'm at with like a whole bunch of information. And I want to include that because it seemed to be like here recently I've been thinking about whether or not Juneteenth is the idea of COVID-19 having some idea of a political celebration as like graffiti and confetti. It's like beyond Bureau of Vital Statistics and birth certificates of the footprint as carbon footprint as like biometrics involving the structure having earned the vesture. And all that idea of like investment terminology of human capital beyond the method of banking, and like at a minimum Grover Cleveland, the US $1,000 bill that way, and like Zion National Park in Utah. And ultimately, the thing about, the Ulysses S. Grant being on the 50 in Utah, being all 50 in June, about a baptism of Six Flags, June 14th, 1992, thing about June being 50 on 14th, being like, the Alpha Americans like June 14th, being like, Alpha Americans 64 in American and HTTP, or, Israel, and all that information. It seemed to be the Six Flags baptism. I mean, like Salvos and Bell reach out and touch someone, I mean, for real. And, the Alpha Americans Better Business Bureau being BBB, and a bird bath baptism, I mean, for real. And a VPN being the Alpha Americans 6. And a power squared and E equal MC squared of it like that way. I mean, for real. So, like, anyway, it seemed to be like, that this is the year 2025, but ultimately it seems to be really the information that I wanted to include real quick, because it seemed whether or not if a preliminary prejudice of product registration of a birth certificate is just the idea of a political science celebration of graffiti and confetti of a birth certificate and a footprint, or the idea of a baptism, and in my case it has been like an experience resulting in some idea of a Stargate program, an Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program, and only because of the memory minus the fact of being like the real issue of memory 25, 30 years later, depending on what point of origin. It's really, really the year 2022 and me on YouTube, and a lot of other stuff going on, and a bunch of things about some retroactive, like, idea of like intellectual representing some idea of like a grandfathered corporate law of retroactive presidential, administration, a lot on YouTube, and like, what really is like going on, about a lot of things like on YouTube. So like, it seemed to be like really when I was like getting on YouTube with my drums, and you can see me on my channel at Wade ASV, Pretty PRDDY, at youtube.com, and that's me on a Pearl Vision VSX drum set, a double bass. It's like a total of completely everything, like 35 pieces, including hardware, cymbals, special effects, and my drum tone and snare and hi-hat. I mean, even the hi-hat, tambourine, and, you know, special effects bell, and, you know, 3 rotos and like 4 octobans, and they're like 35 piece included. I mean, like everything, okay? And like I'm working on getting the Pearl Vision VSX in the Strata Blue. A lot going on, but, you know, I want to include that because it seemed to be, you know, really the idea of whether or not if a carbon footprint and absentee voting is the only idea of whether or not it seemed to be the highlighting factor, like Juneteenth, using COVID-19 as a method of banking, as suppression or loss prevention in the form of what only seemed to be whether or not if, you know, maintaining some idea of staying in the bank, or, you know, some idea of a boycott and embargo, presenting some issue of clearance. Similarly, you know, not my thought of like an economic plea bargain, Ponzi scheming, raffling, voucher, auctioneering, clearance, and warehousing as loss prevention, or, you know, what the real deal about, you know, a boycott and embargo really is as a method of banking, of holding, and what that is as a storage area network as compared to securities and annuities. You know, right now it seems to be like, you know, including some idea like what was going on during the Stargate program of, like, you know, air raids. Hopefully even, you know, like 4 inches on each side of my arm of the humerus bone being removed, and it seemed to be now, it seemed to be like the forecast of, you know, like, you know, the spore stone being used in orthopedic surgery is some idea as a forecast. I mean, you know, like I'd realized that I was having to lean, you know, from side to side, and I found it hard to believe, like, how could I not know that it had been operated and 4 inches of my humerus bone had been removed on both sides of my humerus bone. And hopefully it's really been this way about blood flow and circulation. It seemed to be like whether or not if anything else other than that, and including some remote controlling my freaking main arteries, or, you know, blood flow and circulation. Seemingly, you know, the idea of like circulation, I mean, involving, you know, like the blood vessel and main arteries, and like I see that, and it seemed to be like really not cool about the thought of like a remote control lab bounds, and some of my body, or, you know, some idea like Stephen F. Austin, like the $6 million man, going through like a vice president network, and some idea of like an Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program, because, you know, I'd like, you know, like 4 inches of my humerus bone, you know, back on my arms. And it seemed to be, you know, the thing about World News presenting the spore stone that way, that's used in orthopedic surgery, and it seemed to be almost like the forecast of, you know, like international banking systems on the front lines of the beachfront, or, you know, making a great beyond like local area network of internet protocol of maritime law. Getting all amphibious about, you know, some idea, seemed to be the America Online, presenting, you know, Apple and Oracle as compared to the thought of like a transition of the Orion performance monitoring, even like one Justice Park or My Name Wade. It seemed to be like just, you know, the one thing between like the alphanumerics of 33 and 34, and the alphanumerics of 213, like my name is like 213, where it's sort of pretty P-R-I-D-D-Y, and my thought of like something amphibious in J. Edgar Hoover, even representative of one Justice Park of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, being some idea of like, you know, Aryan Justice Park. And it seemed to be, I mean, the difference between AOL being Aryan, Arian, and Orion, and it really seemed to be, you know, the idea of like the whole idea of like a new world man, you kidding me? An entire like world, like, you know, vice president network and president, you know, as maybe not a carbon footprint, and an entire lifetime of not realizing a vice president network had been involved of importing, exporting, or the thought of carbon footprints and absentee voting. As the Ulysses S. Grant issue, combining a student loan to a Pell Grant, as like, ultimately it seemed to be the deal about, you know, the exclusionary rule provision. And the thing about, you know, Wyatt Earp, and think about our rural routes, or Route 66, and ultimately even Chevrolet Avalanche Z66, and it seemed to be the Route 66, and being like the Better Business Bureau, the BBB, and a bird bat baptism. Route 66, I mean 6 and 6, a vice president network to VPNs, the Alphanumerics of 52, yet the Alphanumerics of 6 itself, and the BBB is the Better Business Bureau. I mean, the baptism. Reach out and touch someone. The Southwestern Bell, reach out and touch someone. I mean, for real, Better Business Bureau, bird bath baptism. I mean, for real, the Psychic Warrior, America's foremost psychic spy, and to cover up the top secret CIA Stargate program. I mean, for real. And it seemed to be the Six Flags baptism thing about the Alphanumerics between 1995 to 2001 in the World Trade Center. I mean, based upon my experience, a bunch of air raids going on there in 1995, even more specifically, convinced me that there were anything other than multiple locations of identical perception of the World Trade Center. I mean, 1995, anything other than 1995 would only be, I thought of knowing a vice president network being in control of an entire world news circuit of television, and a 6-year difference between 1995 of the skyline is like the Alphanumerics in 95, okay, and 911 is automatically the emergency call, and emergency being Alphanumerics in 95, and ultimately the thing about the Alphanumerics is 6 and a VPN, a difference of 6 and a Six Flag Bird Bath Baptist, ultimately Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program. And when memory became the issue is only when I really for the first time started referring to going through a circuit as a Stargate program, ultimately getting to the Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program. And it was only because memory being a factor going beyond the idea of different locations around the entire world, other than what the perception of a circuit would maybe normally be, as compared to realizing memory had actually presenting something beyond of a Stargate program at different locations involving Wing International and State of the Union address, and I'm not sure if I could even distinguish the difference, of Warner Atlantic and Electra as Wing International, Warner, Electra, and Atlantic, or even Capitol Records. I mean for real, and entertainment that way in the Houston, Texas area. Alphanumerics 181, Electronic Power, Houston, Texas, and Wing International Selective Service. But ultimately, it seemed to be that really the idea that Selective Service had presented the issue of the Spore Stone, in search of an umbilical cord in space exploration as the mother lode, or some idea of the humorous bone as a forecast. And it seemed to be the big Formula 44 of it being a forecast as even the principle of the Better Business Bureau being Route 66, or the thing about 66 being the BBB and the BBB of the Better Business Bureau. I mean, a bird bath baptism. I mean, for real. And the Vice President network that way, and Six Flags that way. Yeah, so it's ultimately got to a whole bunch of information like that in that way. So in any case, it seemed to be that ultimately, distinguishing whether or not if a political science celebration of graffiti and confetti is really the only idea of a carbon footprint and absentee voting of a birth certificate, or FDIC claims being used as some idea of relation. Relation, what relation? The pi r squared relation, or some half-mast, erection in an igloo. I mean, hey, skip all the crap, okay? The idea of relation, or some idea of what's the real issue of Six Flags and a Vice President network using the length of what? The humorous bone, or the grasping capacity of don't tell me it's solitaire, and some idea of a Whitney Houston song, because the greatest love of all is happening to me. Learning to love myself, is that what's going on? It's a Whitney Houston song. Am I learning to love myself? Am I really getting it on in that way, huh? As an FDIC claim, really, an FDIC claim? An FDIC claim distinguishes the difference between litigation de facto or habeas corpus between Marcus Welby and Quincy. As some idea a Juneteenth, highlighting some issue of that seem to be reflecting some idea between Juneteenth highlighting COVID-19 as a method of banking, as a boycott and embargo, as suppression and loss prevention in the way of monetary domestic of neighborhoods as compared to the commercial venue of living quarters, obviously of gross national product and economics, define the meaning of what only availability mean based upon the idea of a corporate level as compared to a business law. Yet, the difference between a plain horizon of the eccentric triangles as compared to the pie chart. Yet, it's ultimately the backside of the U.S. $1 bill of even the thought of Centerpoint Energy or what the real deal is about the North American Free Trade Act and energy trading, about the smart meter being used as a transponder, or some idea of the one and only latitude in orbit circling the Earth as like some halo as a 90 degree. At what point the 90 degree of like the smart meter being used as a transponder, as a latitude right here, as like some haloed angel, and all this is going on, and you're presenting a mood altering religious experience as like what? A claim as what? The alphanumeric 71 of like a CIA angel, or the way it's spelled as some idea of Barack Obama's own words trying to demonize someone as like some idea as like a misappropriation allocation of Mississippi comparable to the information defining as what the U.S. dollar only means below the equator of Latin terminology. Yet there's the movie Dead Below Zero, and then there's the commercial or the content. I've always been chasing rainbows, waiting for little bluebirds. And then there's like Judy Garland, the city of Kansas City, home of one of the 12 photo reserve banks in Kansas City, and Judy Garland, the Wizard of Oz, somewhere of the rainbow, bluebirds fly. And well, it's obviously, the idea of like the one latitude in the center line of oscillation represented the equator at 90 degrees, presenting the circle with the dot in, and center point energy being used as a transponder. Is it really the transponder, or is it like region zero? The idea of like the euro dollar, and still a question of region zero, presenting some idea of whether or not if region one is, claiming, intellectual property as like a carbon footprint, or, Vice President Networks having some idea of a carbon footprint, and absentee voting is like graffiti and confetti beyond like the Bureau of Vital Statistics birth certificate and the footprint, or making a grade, beyond, the footprint of like biometrics. Really? Is that really where the grade's at? Really? Biometrics? Yet going beyond biometrics, and the real deal about beyond biometrics is a bunch of white stuff of invisible computer programming. Seems to be the only reality about knowing that much about biometrics is that it goes beyond, what is normally the perception of biometrics and security, and whether it's security or not. The issue is that it gets into a whole bunch of white stuff and invisible programming of light scribe. And ultimately, even the thing about, the laser and certain factors involving, really even, the Oval Office in the White House, and the prefix 4, 5, and 6, and the Blue Angels representative, the prefix of the White House 4, 5, and 6, and, ultimately, the California Angels. So, all this talk, it's like, no one's saying a word, but it seems to be really center point energy is being used as a halo, as a latitude, right here, just because it's a mood altering religious experience, or maybe, would it be too nice to like sound like an angel, or like what's going on in depreciation and what domestic and monetary aggregates as compared to a commercial venue of living quarters not affected by television programming, and like all this is going on about really it's not that I've chosen it as the idea of like depreciation or some like health issue or some crisis management by proxy, or some like, controlling my erection as a half-mass erection. So like, where's all the eyeballs and, above the beltway about it, right? Or some FDIC claim? Are you kidding me? As a carbon footprint? Some idea of relation between architecture and platform of whether or not if the kernel is identifying whether or not if a partition is the only idea of, a medical power of attorney using a deed restriction, like Dr. Pepper is a deed restriction. A medical power of attorney using a fictional real estate is a deed restriction, and like mechanics lien. So like, what's going on with all this, like in house? It seems to be like, really? Air quality, huh? Is that like highlighting, Juneteenth is like a COVID-19 as a method of banking of a boycott embargo? Or is it the idea of like Barack Obama's own words as a color code? Or is it really a political science measures like idea of like a thermocouple semiconductor, and some idea of like really what it's a pair of drumsticks, a Promark drumsticks? It's like what, a thermocouple semiconductor what is that, the Colonel's idea of, like, being a drummer and, like, finger looking good? Are you kidding me? I mean, it's a pair of drumsticks, okay? Or Univision using 3 pastels in black like a rim of a black dot drum head, and ultimately the 3 pastels in white like an Aquarian Power white dot. And it seemed to be the only thing about the color white that seemed to be whether it can, if it wants to be, a pastel or not. But yet it seemed to be the only thing about white not being a requirement as a pastel or not a pastel. Seemed to be the only thing about the white thing about it. And Univision that way. But, it seemed to be like whether or not, if really, ultimately, if the difference between business and corporate law of an FDIC claim is the only idea of a colon or a ratio //. And say, I'm not a claimant. I'm like right here in Pearland, Texas, born in Houston, Texas. I mean, is it really an issue of like Region 0 as a binary number of the United States claiming whether or not if some idea of like having fair use has been presenting, the availability as economics of a vice president network, as a carbon footprint and absentee voting as a method of banking, or monopolizing capitalization using a student loan combined with a Pell Grant? The word presence, normally in legal research and writing, case presence is normally the thought of the latest, whether it be citing codes annotated as compared to overruling an opinionated decision, or situational, as I don't like really using the word circumstantial evidence. The thing with this is that in corporate law, litigation de facto res habeas corpus is normally only identifying, normally, maybe to some people's surprise, it maybe had been led to believe that de facto is seemed to be the only issue of lifespan, defining the meaning of whether or not, if corporate terminology, normally the word in corporate terminology is annuity. Litigation is a word in corporate law, yet de facto being the idea of what lifespan only means, and I'm assuming almost what economics only provides as availability, and what writ of habeas corpus seem to be the only issue of whether or not, if deed restrictions is the issue of a boycott and embargo as television programming or auditing legal media is really what it's ultimately getting to. Or, don't tell me the excuse of, some non-decreed issue like the Return of the Jedi and EA Sports presenting some idea as constitutional law, being led to believe, and anyone can believe anything to want, constitutional law. I mean, really, the thing with this is that, there's a agreed and not agreed, or what seems to be the idea of international law of having fair use of intellectual property only seem to be whether or not if a vice president network is issue or not, or a straight up, presidential, straightforward, not a question of, immigration custom enforcement or importing and exporting, or boundaries and limitation that will only be presented as non-degreed or remotely some idea geographically attached as, the anticipation maybe of a news anchor. It would be more so the idea maybe identifying maybe the categorization of money as the U.S. dollar, or maybe not, based upon, the endorsement of an entire, not limited to employment history, based upon, some idea of grandfathered corporate law of retroactive presidential administration as a method of banking of a bunch of endorsements that would normally be only the idea based upon my experience, and neglect based upon lack of experiences has led to some idea of, some reacting factors leading to some demanded participating requirements of, like, ultimately, going through a circuit, ultimately, even 25 years after the fact, memory minus de facto being the alphanumerics of 35, or Austin Powers Blue Body Imperial Legal, the thing about, 35 being NASA, and ultimately, National Aeronautics Space Administration, and, all that live on air stuff about, saying to me, Data Foundry uses the acronym RAID. I wasn't real clear on everything involved with it, and it's not that I'm trying to throw networking off as an acronym RAID, but, the phrase of an air raid going through a circuit while I'm asleep isn't the automatic perception of just like knowing that Data Foundry is one that uses that acronym RAID. Not that it has to be a black flag, or is it the idea of maybe jurisprudence with the black back only representative of what, highlighting the thought of like Grover Cleveland and Zion National Park in Utah as what, highlighting Juneteenth, as COVID-19 highlighting Zion National Park as 1,000 years of peace, as a Mormon like an American religion as compared to what, the misappropriation allocation, not knowing anything about African Americans or Israel being 64 and American 64, or the movie as compared to live on air and television, HTTP :// as compared to the idea that all that live on air stuff as compared to the movie, and now African Americans are like 64. I mean, ultimately it gets to whether or not if, human capital, beyond a method of banking, it's just the beginning of the investment terminology of Grover Cleveland on the U.S. $1,000 bill. There's some idea of like Yul Brynner and Moses, and the Ten Commandments, being presented on two tablets in the form of Texas and New Mexico power in Pearland, Texas, as something like Roosevelt New Deal Act of the International Electronic Engineering and OPEC, and the Wyatt Earp, and the thing about One Justice Park seemed to be about the rural Route 1 issue of like Wyatt Earp and the exclusionary rule provision, the ERP, now from America 39, and the IEEO and OPEC and the Roosevelt New Deal Act seem to be presenting that issue about the energy thing. It seemed to be the lifespan of de facto of when it seemed to be whether or not if economics is controlling only what availability means of the real information involving the energy side of like the Roosevelt New Deal Act, or Region 1 in the United States and Canada as compared to Region 0, presenting some issues that seem to be the non-degree thing below the equator, and a whole bunch of information, or the center line of oscillation representing some idea of the 60 books, 60 Temple House Federal Reserve country defining the meaning of Latin terminology of the U.S. dollar, even Al Qaeda's statement of like involving, like Al Qaeda, or some reference identifying, what seemed to be even the Pulse Club in Florida, or like Cricket Wireless identifying like a Pulse phone being sold in Pearland by Cricket Wireless, or some like, province color code of the golf course of jurisprudence with a black back on it, or Obama referring to like, trying to demonize, he refers to Al Qaeda, and knowing what I know about linguistic African Americans is kind of like really not cool, or some transition that it would even be representative, of a baptism, so not cool about, my experience, and not one word being said. And the thing of it is that really ultimately it seemed to be like whether or not if Al Qaeda is ultimately getting to Barack Obama's thing about the sickest of Temple House that runs the country, representative of the Nile and the Euphrates, what Amazon is to the book of Latin terminology and practical application. Yet it presents, Al Qaeda, the area of the Persian Gulf, and yet at the same time it presents the acronym OSHA and that one letter N identifying monetary and domestic as some idea of the Delta Force, and the N applied to OSHA, the acronym being the ocean, and all this information about the ocean and the operator and Region 0, and ultimately even the thing right now seems to be the thing about the 5 eccentric triangles of like AOL, Apple and Oracle, and the AOL, something about they reached the statute in the IRA, and the Apple iPhone SE, and all that information. It's kind of like even the Big Formula 44, ultimately getting to the idea of the humerus bone, and the spore stone being used to replace damaged or missing bone, and something like me experiencing like an air raid while I was asleep and waking up and realizing, I didn't even realize at first, like how could that happen and me not know it, that 4 inches of my humerus bone had been removed, and really likewise, and this should have seemed to be like cardiopulmonary, has placed some like idea of a remote control, controlling my blood flow, main arteries, even, what digestion means by remote control, even other factors involving, procedures that was being so misled and misrepresented, and the whole idea of it being manufactured at a degree level, like far beyond like not cool. and I've not like 4 inches of my humerus bone, whatever the case is, whether it's a spore stone replacing it, and my 4 inches like back on my humerus bone on each side of my arm, including my length about my eyeballs being above my beltway. In relation, you know what the word is, it's relation. Don't tell me it's a half-mass erection in an igloo, and they come from all around the world, naming a tune in one whole note on Neptune, like an ice fisherman in an igloo, a half-mass erection in an igloo, as the Arctic Circle, some idea like copacetic terminology in television programming. It seemed to be ultimately leading even to the Line 6 electric guitar combo amp of the V-Series. Line 6 is an alphanumeric of Guitar Airlines, Boeing, and Emirates Airlines. Something like the Permian Basin, and the Permian Basin representing a birth certificate of footprints, even a plateau. Even like the appraisal of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ on Mount Olives, re-entering heaven, ascending into the sky. So the baptism, okay? So what is it really? Is it really the idea that highlighting, celebrating what Juneteenth is COVID-19 as a method of banking? The alphanumeric is 72, COVID-19, the categorization of money as a method of banking, as a boycott, embargo, as loss prevention, as suppression of monetary and domestic aggregates in that way, as compared to a commercial venue of living quarters? Is it automatic perception that de facto is the lifespan that economics provide only what availability only means, based on really knowing or not knowing, just because I feel like saying what it is I have to say about it now? Or some idea of GMAC promissory notes reflecting some alphanumerics of like 24 and HOA, or Washington Post representing like legal media and deposition before and after, applied to the acronym HOA, HOA of Homeowners Association, representing what? Monetary and domestic? And the whoopah bird, blue and purple bird with Washington Post WP applied to the acronym HOA, the pronunciation of the one bird, the Israeli bird, like Austin-powered Bluebonnet Imperial Eagle would be to the blue and purple, it's one bird, blue and purple, the Israeli bird, called the whoopah, yet the same pronunciation of the oldest governmental computer mainframe, called the whopper, and proper English numerical composition, with the P being visible and like silent, with the R in whopper being a whoopah, and what it all means, as some idea of what a method of banking, as suppression and loss prevention, as a boycott embargo, a degree level of representatives to consensual participation. Oh, is it really? Is that what it is, as intellectual property having fair use of what family law is, monopolizing capitalization in that way? Ultimately, Route 66 is some idea of what Chevrolet Avalanche Z66, and over a baptism of 66 being the Better Business Bureau BBB, and a bird baptism of Route 66, of the exclusionary rule provision of executive power, sovereign immunities, and governmental amnesties. I haven't heard not one word about it. It's just that I'm the only one seemingly thinking that, I've spent decades really getting serious about it. So this is what I have to say about it. Okay, ultimately, the idea of changing the entire geographical area, becoming a Star is Born, because I feel like being a superstar, okay? Okay, I'm a drummer, okay? I like singing too, not having to issue continually contesting factors of air quality, of whether or not, if live on air is on the idea of whether or not, it seems to be whether or not, if Access only presents the idea of a vice president network as a promissory note of General Motors, a promissory note as compared to the IEE, International Electronic Engineering Organization, or what lifespan is in de facto as a promissory note of FDIC claiming. Are you kidding me? Over what? The length of my humerus bone and what? My erection? As an FDIC claim of loss prevention? Really? So what does that mean in Safari? Are you managing, really, relation? It's not, it's still going on? Not one word about it, and what, you don't have anything to say about it? Is that what's really going on, or is it the idea of what? The Consumer Report Price Index? So, what does that mean? So that means like I'm not a Colombian as a carbon footprint. Really? I mean, like, am I supposed to know the difference? I mean, is it a question? I'm not Colombian. I'm not really Mexican or Hispanic. I mean, is that an issue as a U.S. dollar? Or Latin terminology? Or maybe even Notre Dame, maybe, in a color code of what? A common denominator is gold. And McDonald's little arches as compared to what the green, purple, and blue of Notre Dame, the similarities of information of like Latin terminology. It seemed to be the Notre Dame thing, and the similarities of all that information of Austin Powers, Blue Bonnet, Imperial Eagle, and a color code from like Los Angeles of the UN, of the pluribus, and the banner and the eagle's beak, identifying attenuation as compared to attention and the absolute salute of that one word attenuation, and the UA thing about U and A being 22 and the FDIC and RCA Radio Corporation America and FBI psychology that way. And it seemed to be the thing about attenuation and the alphanumerics being 140 in Pearland, Texas, and Holy Miracles, and even the Purple Heart thing. That seemed to be, you know, just an acronym of the EPA, of Electronic Power of America and the USA, you know, applied to, you know, the alphanumerics of 140, alphanumerics USA being an attenuation USA, or the EPA Electronic Power of America being alphanumerics 181, Houston, Texas Electronic Power, we international, and selective service. And it seemed to be like all that information has ultimately, you know, been the idea of a forecast of, you know, what infantry is in a diaper based upon Barbara Walters and Hugh Downs presenting some idea of the view and the memory of an infant in diapers of like 1965. And even the Social Security Administration's phone number, 1-800-772-1213, being an idea of a birth year of the fourth generation of 1964, based upon 12 and 13 being L&M, Lockheed Martin, and legal media. Ultimately, even, you know, the idea of like 64 and 65, or COVID ID 19 placing 1964 as 83, and 1965 as 84 as what? An embassy in the States? 84 lumber, I'm not thinking that it's 84 lumber other than, you know, I'm not the Colombian. Just because Brazoria is like 90, it seems to be really, right now, it seems to be the center line of oscillation, and 1 cycle per second being measured with the center line of oscillation at a 90 degree presents, you know, what a center point energy smart meter really is. It's like the issue of whether or not if Texas New Mexico Power is presenting the idea of like 2 halo orbital as a latitude and a 90 degree. It seemed to be the only thing about the equator at a 90 degree, and the fish swimming upstream as the delta force, the biggest mouth of the river, and like the Israeli flag and the Star of David and the 6-point star representing Texas New Mexico Power, or even Moses with the 2 talents presenting Texas New Mexico Power as some like lifespan and de facto of some like grandfathered corporate laws, retroactive presidential administration, and what the Israeli flag seemed to be of 6-point stars, 2 triangles representing, you know, what seemed to be the misappropriation allocation of the Mississippi, the biggest mouth of the river, involving Amazon, or, you know, the Nile and Euphrates that way, based on the description of information in Secret Temple, how the Federal Reserve runs the country, and all that information, okay? Anyway, like, I'm going to take a break, okay? But that's where it's at, and like, the way my life is, anyway. So, like, anyway, so, like, yeah, so I'm really thinking about, you know, the Vision's Tower of Power right here. 75 floors. That might as well include 3 in addition, 25 floors. You know. Okay, like this is year 2025, okay? I, like, just turned 60. August 6, from 1964. This is the year being the 2025. August 6 is my birthday. And, yeah, I just turned 60. Oh, wow. And I actually bought the VEISE, the VEISE automatic, you know, deadbolt door lock. It's got the 3 lines, and it seemed to be the thing about the Israeli flag. It's the center line of oscillation. So, like, where's the cycle per second? It seemed to be the 3 lines representative of, like, a whole lot of things. About the 3 lines in Lockheed Martin. And the 5th dimension Orion Performance Monitoring America Online Apple and Oracle and the eccentric triangles of Lockheed Martin, even the eccentric triangles up the fifth dimension, up in the air, the beautiful blue, and hopefully Orion Performance Mountain, or even One Justice Park, the FBI becoming Aryan Justice Park. There's some idea of a whole new perception beyond maritime law. My name is Wade, okay, but my alphanumeric in my name is 213, and it seemed to be the Aryan Science of that thing to do, being all amphibious about, J. Edgar Hoover and, what he is about the Hoover and the hovercraft, and being all amphibious about, the thing about the FBI. Yeah, for real. So, anyway, that's what I have to say about it, right now. Just seemed to be the thing about, making a grade beyond, internet protocol of a local area network, a maritime law, or surfing the internet being the issue. So, really, but anyway, yeah, so, it's already going on, 55 minutes and, 45 seconds. So, I'm going to take a break right there. There it is, yeah.